My name is Maya. I am 32 years old and the founder of a $10 million tech company. At least I was, until my father handed my entire life's work to my entitled brother. Sign the papers, Maya, my father demanded, while my brother smirked from my chair. Women are meant to support the family, not lead it. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply stared at the people who shared my blood and realized they were my greatest enemies. What they did not know was that the paper they were trying to force me to sign was going to absolutely ruin their lives. Before I dive into exactly how I made my family beg for my mercy, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe. If you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth, you are going to love this story. The heavy oak doors of the Oraglow Tech boardroom felt entirely too heavy that Tuesday afternoon. Golden hour sunlight was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling glass panels of our Atlanta penthouse office. The light caught the dust motes in the air, creating a warm and inviting glow that sharply contrasted with the freezing and suffocating atmosphere inside the room. I had built this space from absolutely nothing. I personally chose the emerald green chairs that lined the massive mahogany table. I negotiated the lease for this entire floor when my company was just an ambitious idea mapped out on a whiteboard in my cramped one-bedroom apartment. Yet as I walked in wearing my best silk suit, the air in my own boardroom felt like a vacuum. I took slow and deliberate steps across the room, feeling the eyes of my family tracking my every move. The silence was thick and heavy, filled with the kind of unspoken tension that only a toxic family can generate. At the head of the long table sat my father, Reginald. He did not look at me with the pride a father should have for a daughter who built a logistics software empire from scratch. He looked at me like a stubborn and disobedient employee who was standing in his way. He wore a stiff navy suit, his posture rigid and unyielding, projecting the exact same overbearing authority he demanded at every Sunday dinner we ever had growing up. To his right sat my older brother Jamal. Jamal was 35 and possessed a Master of Business Administration degree that he had never successfully used in the real world. He was the classic golden child, a man who had been handed every opportunity and somehow managed to squander all of them. He was currently spinning a gold monogrammed pen between his fingers, leaning back and looking completely comfortable in the executive chair I had paid for with my own sweat and tears. His posture reeked of unearned confidence and sheer arrogance. Next to Jamal was his wife, Chloe. She was adjusting her designer silk scarf, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a patronizing smile that I had come to absolutely despise over the years. Chloe loved to play the role of the supportive sister-in-law while subtly tearing me down at every given opportunity. She looked around my boardroom as if she were touring a house she had just bought at a massive discount, her eyes assessing the expensive artwork and the panoramic view of the Atlanta skyline. She rested her hand on Jamal's arm, a silent gesture of solidarity that made my stomach turn. They looked like a united front, a royal couple ready to ascend the throne that I had spent the last 10 years building. "Have a seat, Maya," my father said. His voice was cold and clipped, leaving absolutely no room for discussion. I remained standing, gripping the leather handle of my briefcase, refusing to shrink under his heavy and oppressive gaze. "The transfer agreement is ready," he continued, sliding a thick stack of legal documents across the polished wood of the table. "I am officially naming Jamal the Chief Executive Officer of Oraglow Tech effective immediately. You will transition to Vice President of Operations to support his leadership." The sheer audacity of his words hung in the empty space between us. I looked down at the documents, thick with legal jargon designed to completely erase my ownership, and then I looked right back at my father. I was the one who wrote the original code. I was the one who stayed up for 72 hours straight fixing the supply chain algorithms for our minority-owned beauty brand partners. My father had simply loaned me $50,000 when I was 22 and drowning in student debt. In exchange, he had insisted on putting the holding company under his name. "It is just a formality to protect you," he had told me back then. Now that formality was the exact weapon he was using to execute a corporate coup against his own daughter. He was taking the fruits of my relentless labor and handing them to his golden boy on a silver platter. Jamal stopped spinning his pen and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass tabletop. "Come on, Maya," he said, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Do not make this harder than it has to be. You have done a cute job getting the startup off the ground, but it is time for a real man to scale the business. Dad and I have a vision for the future. You are just too emotional to handle the big leagues anyway. We need aggressive leadership, not someone who coddles the staff." Chloe let out a soft and condescending chuckle. She reached over and patted Jamal on the arm before looking at me with fake sympathy in her eyes. "Honestly, Maya, you should be thanking us," Chloe said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Women our age really need to start thinking about stepping back and focusing on building a family. You have been working yourself to the bone for years. Let the men handle the heavy lifting and the stress. You can finally have some time to find a husband and settle down. Maybe start a nice little hobby. I already have some wonderful ideas for the marketing department that Jamal is going to let me implement once we clear out some of your old staff." I stared at the three of them, absorbing the absolute betrayal radiating from their pores. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming thick and entirely unbearable for them. I could see my father shift uncomfortably in his leather seat under my steady and unwavering gaze. He tapped his fingers impatiently against the mahogany wood, clearing his throat as the quiet stretched past the point of social comfort. Jamal shifted his weight, suddenly losing a fraction of his arrogant bravado as he waited for me to explode. They were absolutely expecting a fight. They had braced themselves for a massive war. They were expecting me to scream, to cry, to beg for my company back, to throw a massive tantrum and hurl wild accusations across the room. They were completely ready to call me hysterical, to use my reaction as immediate proof that I was indeed too emotional to lead a multi-million-dollar corporation. But I did not give them the satisfaction of a single tear or a raised voice. My terrifying silence contrasted sharply with the loud and smug energy they had brought into the room. I just looked at them, my face a calm and unreadable mask, letting the weight of their own greed suffocate them in the quiet room. My father finally broke the heavy silence. He pushed the solid gold pen an inch closer to my side of the table. "Sign it, Maya," he commanded, his tone completely void of any parental warmth. "Do not make a scene. We have investors flying in from New York tomorrow, and Jamal needs to be fully instated before the quarterly review." Chloe leaned forward, resting her chin on her perfectly manicured hands. "It really is for the best, sweetie," she said, tilting her head with a look of manufactured pity. "You look so incredibly exhausted lately. Those dark circles under your eyes are getting impossible to hide, even with all that expensive makeup you buy. Take a long vacation. Go to a wellness retreat in Bali. Let Jamal handle the stress of the boardroom while you focus on some much-needed self-care. You might even find a husband if you stop intimidating every man you meet with your obsessive work habits." I shifted my gaze from my father to my sister-in-law. I did not scowl. I did not roll my eyes. I simply let a small, razor-sharp smile touch the corners of my mouth. "A wellness retreat," I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue with a heavy dose of calculated amusement. That is a truly fascinating suggestion coming from a woman whose entire career consists of spending my brother's monthly allowance. But you are absolutely right about one thing, Chloe. I am exhausted. I am utterly exhausted from carrying the financial weight of this entire family on my back for the last decade." Jamal scoffed loudly, slamming his hand flat against the thick glass of the table. "You see, Dad?" Jamal barked, his face flushing with immediate anger. "This is exactly what I am talking about. She is bitter. She is erratic. She cannot even handle constructive criticism from her own family without turning it into a personal attack. This is why the board needs a steady masculine hand at the wheel. She is too emotionally fragile to lead us into the next fiscal year." I did not raise my voice to match his sudden and pathetic outburst. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high, projecting a quiet dominance that made his loud aggression look incredibly weak. "I am not attacking anyone, Jamal. I said, my voice dropping to a low and steady timbre that commanded the entire room. I am simply stating a documented fact. You want the throne, you want the title, the corner office, and the prestige of calling yourself a tech founder. You want the magazine covers and the luxury cars. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the cold, heavy metal of the pen. The room collectively held its breath. My father leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on the tip of the pen, as if his entire life depended on it. I looked down at the contract sitting in front of me. The paper was thick and expensive, littered with aggressive legal clauses designed to strip me of my equity, my voting rights, and my title as Chief Executive Officer. I read the top line silently to myself. Section 4, Paragraph B. Immediate surrender of all executive privileges and operational control. A normal person would have hired a team of ruthless corporate lawyers to fight this hostile takeover. A normal person would have dragged their family through years of vicious public litigation to protect their $10 million baby. They would have called the press, leaked the family drama, and fought tooth and nail for every single percentage of equity. But I was not a normal person, and Origlow Tech was no longer a helpless baby. It was a massive, complex machine, and I was the only person in the world holding the keys to the engine. I pressed the tip of the pen against the signature line. The ink flowed smoothly, black and final. I signed my full name. I did not let my hand tremble for even a fraction of a second. I did not hesitate. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation wash over my entire body. I was not signing away my life. I was signing my own emancipation papers. I slid the signed document back across the table. My father exhaled a sharp, heavy breath of relief, the tension leaving his stiff shoulders almost instantly. He reached for the paper with greedy hands, pulling it toward his chest, as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Jamal broke into a massive, teeth-baring smile, immediately grabbing his smartphone, likely to update his professional profile to Chief Executive Officer before I even left the building. Chloe clapped her hands together, a single sharp sound of victory that echoed obnoxiously in the quiet room. I stood up slowly and deliberately. I snapped my leather briefcase shut, the sharp click cutting through their silent celebration. I smoothed the lapels of my emerald green suit, ensuring I looked absolutely flawless. I looked down at the three of them sitting at my mahogany table. They looked like a pack of starving wolves who thought they had just cornered a helpless deer, completely unaware that they had actually walked right into a steel trap. "The company is all yours, Jamal," I said, my tone eerily polite and smooth. "I wish you the exact level of success that you truly deserve." Without waiting for his response, I turned around and walked toward the heavy glass doors. I did not storm out in a fit of rage. I did not run away in tears. I walked with the measured, deliberate pace of a queen leaving a burning castle. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of my heels striking the hardwood floor acted as a metronome for their impending doom. Every step I took was a countdown to the absolute destruction of their unearned arrogance. Once I was out in the hallway, the heavy boardroom doors swung shut behind me, sealing them inside their newly acquired tomb. I walked through the main floor of the office. I passed the rows of sleek modern desks where my incredibly talented staff sat. These were brilliant engineers, dedicated strategists, and loyal marketing directors. Most of them were talented people of color, who I had personally mentored and hired when other tech companies refused to give them a fair chance. They looked up at me with worried expressions, sensing the drastic shift in the atmosphere. Marcus, my lead developer, caught my eye and gave me a confused look. I offered him a warm, reassuring smile. I knew exactly what was coming for them, and I had already made plans to protect the people who actually mattered. For years, I had allowed guilt to chain me to my toxic relatives. I had paid the black tax, willingly covering mortgages, paying off Jamal's terrible gambling debts, and funding Chloe's lavish lifestyle because society told me that family always comes first. When you are the only successful person in your family, everyone else suddenly treats your bank account like it is public property. They expect you to bleed yourself dry to keep them comfortable. But sitting in that boardroom watching them try to steal my legacy, the final chain of obligation completely snapped. I owed them absolutely nothing. My loyalty had been weaponized against me for the very last time. I stepped into the private executive elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the brushed steel doors slid completely shut, blocking out the view of the company I built, I finally allowed a genuine razor-sharp smile to spread across my face. I pulled my phone from my pocket and sent a single text message to my corporate attorney. The message simply said, "It is done, initiate phase 2. Why did I give up a $10 million empire without a single fight? Why did I hand over the keys to the kingdom to a brother who could barely balance his own personal checking account, let alone a complex corporate ledger? Because in the ruthless world of high-stakes technology and corporate law, the name on the front of the building does not mean absolutely anything if you do not own the foundation it sits on. My father and my brother thought they had just staged the perfect corporate coup. They thought they had outsmarted me using a technicality from a decade-old business loan. They had spent the last month secretly meeting with expensive corporate attorneys, drafting what they believed were airtight contracts to push me out of my own creation. They had spent weeks plotting my downfall over expensive dinners that were paid for by the very company I built. They were so incredibly focused on stealing my executive chair that they never bothered to look under the floorboards. They never bothered to read the fine print of our vendor agreements. They never bothered to check the legal registration of the intellectual property that actually made our software function. I walked out through the revolving glass doors of the lobby and stepped into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The bright sun hit my face and I took a deep, refreshing breath of city air. I did not feel like a woman who had just lost her life savings. I felt like a woman who had just dropped a lit match into a room full of gasoline and locked the door from the outside. Jamal wanted to be the big boss. He wanted the glory, the money, the respect, and the power. But what he just signed up for was a ticking time bomb. And by the time he realized he was holding it, it would already be entirely too late. Over the next 3 weeks, my phone remained completely silent from my family. My personal email, however, was an entirely different story. It was flooded with panicked and heartbroken messages from my former employees. Jamal and Chloe wasted absolutely no time executing their grand vision for AuraGlow Tech. If you were watching a movie, this would be the fast-paced montage where the villains completely destroy everything the hero built. They moved through my company like a pair of reckless toddlers who had just been handed the keys to a massive bulldozer. Chloe immediately appointed herself as the executive vice president of brand management. It was a title she completely made up on her first morning in the building. Her first official act of business was a brutal and systematic purge of the staff. She started with Marcus, my brilliant lead developer, who had written the secondary code for our complex logistics platform. Marcus possessed 2 degrees from Georgia Tech and had been fiercely loyal to me since day one. Chloe fired him on a Tuesday morning simply because he questioned her absurd plan to change the user interface of our software from a professional navy blue to a trendy pastel pink. When Marcus tried to explain that our clients needed clear data visualization, not aesthetic mood boards, Chloe had security escort him out of the building. Within 14 days, Chloe had managed to terminate almost my entire original core team. These were hardworking, highly educated Black men and women who actually understood the intricate nuances of the logistics industry. They were the engine that kept the company running smoothly. She replaced them with a rotating cast of her friends from her morning Pilates class and her exclusive local country club. These were women whose only qualification for working at a $10 million tech startup was their ability to match their designer handbags to their shoes. Suddenly, the engineering department was being run by a woman named Brittany, whose previous work experience consisted of managing a failing boutique candle shop. The client relations department was handed over to a woman who did not even know what a supply chain algorithm was. While Chloe was busy turning the human resources department into her own personal sorority, my brother Jamal was living out his ultimate delusional fantasy of being a tech titan. He completely abandoned the daily operational duties. Instead of reviewing the quarterly supply chain metrics or meeting with our crucial logistics partners to ensure a smooth transition, Jamal focused all of his energy on his public image. He immediately ordered a complete renovation of the executive suite. He tore out the practical office furniture I had carefully selected and replaced it with absurdly expensive imported Italian leather couches and a custom-built mahogany wet bar. Jamal even hired an expensive boutique public relations firm using company funds. He paid them an exorbitant retainer fee to follow him around the office and capture candid shots of him pointing thoughtfully at whiteboards for his professional social media profiles. He was desperately trying to buy his way onto the local 40 under 40 business lists. He wanted the entire city of Atlanta to see him as a brilliant innovator and a self-made genius who was single-handedly revolutionizing the tech industry. My father, Reginald, would drop by the office for lunch and praise Jamal endlessly. He told Jamal that the office finally looked like a real corporate headquarters, instead of a messy startup, completely ignoring the fact that actual work had come to a grinding halt. Behind the expensive photo shoots and the newly installed artisanal espresso machines, the actual business was rapidly bleeding out. Oraglow Tech was built on a very specific and highly delicate business model. We provided optimized shipping routes and vital inventory management for minority-owned beauty brands. Our clients trusted us deeply because we understood their unique market challenges, and we consistently delivered precise results. Jamal did not care about our clients. He saw them as nothing more than numbers on a spreadsheet that existed solely to fund his lavish and newly acquired executive lifestyle. In his fourth week as chief executive officer, Jamal made his first massive operational mistake. Driven by pure greed and an inflated ego, he decided that our monthly subscription fees were simply too low. Without consulting the remaining account managers or looking at a single page of market research, he arbitrarily raised our service rates by 40% across the board. He sent out a generic mass email to our entire client list full of arrogant corporate buzzwords declaring that Oraglow was elevating its brand positioning and that the new prices were strictly non-negotiable. He honestly believed that our clients would just blindly pay the massive increase because they had nowhere else to go. He completely failed to understand that the loyalty those clients had was to me, not to the corporate entity known as Oraglow. When those panicked business owners called the office to complain about the sudden price hike, they were no longer greeted by my dedicated account managers who knew their business intimately. Instead, they were transferred to Chloe and her Pilates friends, who spoke to them with extreme condescension and failed to answer even the most basic technical questions about the software platform. My former clients were furious, insulted, and actively looking for an exit strategy. I watched this entire disaster unfold from the absolute comfort of my newly leased office space, located just 3 blocks away. Every single time Chloe fired one of my core team members, my corporate attorney was waiting for them in the lobby of my new building with a highly lucrative employment contract. I quietly absorbed all the brilliant minds that Jamal and Chloe were foolishly throwing away out of pure spite and incompetence. I was actively rebuilding my empire in the shadows while they were busy painting the walls of my old office pastel pink. Jamal was spending thousands of dollars a day on useless vanity projects, completely draining the operational cash reserves. He approved expense reports for luxury client lunches at 5-star restaurants where no actual clients were even present. He was treating a highly technical and demanding software company like an unlimited credit card, entirely blinded by his own massive ego and the false sense of security my father had given him. Jamal thought he was completely untouchable. He thought he was the undisputed king of Atlanta tech. But a king is only as powerful as the castle he sits in, and Jamal had absolutely no idea that the foundation of his shiny new castle was already rapidly crumbling beneath his designer shoes. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when my phone began to vibrate across the smooth surface of my kitchen island. I was sitting in my luxury apartment overlooking the Atlanta skyline, enjoying a quiet cup of Earl Grey tea. The apartment was completely silent, except for the soft patter of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. For the first time in 10 years, my chest did not feel tight with the relentless pressure of managing a $10 million tech company and a highly toxic family. I was finally at absolute peace. The phone buzzed again, disrupting the quiet room. I looked down at the glowing screen. the caller identification displayed the name Jamal. I let it ring 3 times before I casually swiped my finger across the screen to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply brought the phone to my ear and waited. Immediately, the aggressive and deafening sound of a high-performance engine revving filled the speaker. The roar of the exhaust was so incredibly loud that I had to pull the phone an inch away from my face. "Are you listening to that beautiful sound?" Maya Jamal shouted over the engine noise. His voice was thick with extreme arrogance and unearned pride. "That is the sound of absolute success. I just pulled out of the dealership. Guess who is officially the proud owner of a brand new jet black Porsche 911 Carrera?" I took a slow and deliberate sip of my tea, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. I did not respond. I just let him continue to dig his own grave. Custom imported red leather interior, carbon fiber steering wheel, and the upgraded sport exhaust system. He continued bragging loudly. It cost a cool $215,000. But do not worry, little sister. I did not use my personal savings. I put the entire thing on the Aura Glow corporate platinum credit card. The finance department tried to flag the transaction, but I quickly reminded them who the chief executive officer is now. It is a strictly necessary business expense. A tech founder needs to look the part when he pulls up to expensive investor dinners. You cannot secure massive venture capital driving a practical mid-size sedan like you always did. The sheer level of financial stupidity in his words was almost breathtaking. He had been in charge of my company for exactly 21 days. In that short amount of time, he had fired the core engineering team, alienated our top-paying clients with an absurd 40% price increase, and now he was rapidly draining our carefully managed operational cash reserves to buy a luxury sports car. Oraglow was a highly profitable business, but it was still a young startup. We relied on strict cash flow management to pay for our expensive server costs and vital cloud infrastructure. A $215,000 withdrawal was not just a reckless purchase, it was a massive and fatal wound to the financial stability of the company. Jamal interpreted my continued silence as deep jealousy. "What is the matter, Maya?" He mocked, his tone dripping with absolute venom. "Are you crying in your little apartment right now? Are you finally realizing that you were never the real boss of this family? You were just a placeholder. You were just an employee who kept the seat warm until I was ready to step up and take my rightful place at the head of the table." He laughed cruelly into the receiver. "Dad completely agrees with me, by the way. I showed him the car before I called you. He said it is about time a man in our family drove a vehicle that demands immediate respect. He said I am finally elevating the family legacy to where it belongs. You built a nice little foundation, Maya, but you never had the vision or the sheer courage to take it to the next level. You were always thinking way too small. You acted like a frightened mid-level manager, desperately trying to save pennies when you should have been living like an absolute king. That is exactly why Dad gave the company to me. You are a worker bee, and I am the visionary." I walked over to my window and looked down at the busy city streets below. I watched the cars moving slowly through the rain like tiny metal insects. I thought about the thousands of hours I spent writing complex code in the middle of the night. I thought about the severe panic attacks I suffered trying to meet payroll during our very first year in business. I thought about how I built the exact legacy he was currently sitting inside of. And then I smiled. It was not a sad smile. It was the terrifying smile of a grandmaster chess player who is exactly 3 moves away from a devastating checkmate. "Congratulations, Jamal!" I said, my voice perfectly smooth and completely unbothered. "I am genuinely happy for you. A visionary leader absolutely needs a vehicle that matches his massive ego. It sounds like a gorgeous car." My terrifyingly calm response clearly caught him off guard. The aggressive revving of the engine stopped and the background noise settled into a low, steady idle. "You are not fooling anyone, Maya," he snapped, his voice suddenly highly defensive. "I know you are furious. I know you are sitting there plotting some pathetic way to get back at me. But you cannot touch me. I have the executive title, I have the massive corner office, and I have the full backing of our entire family. You have absolutely nothing. You are completely and entirely isolated. Oh, Jamal, you are absolutely right, I replied, keeping my tone light and conversational. I am just a former employee. I have no power over your brilliant corporate decisions anymore. It is actually quite a massive relief. It is incredibly refreshing to know that when the massive credit card bill arrives next month, I will not be the one forced to write the check. It is so nice to know that when the corporate bank calls asking about the sudden and extreme depletion of the cash reserves, I will not be the one answering the phone. Do you remember 3 years ago when I had to empty my personal savings to pay off your massive gambling debts so you would not go to prison? For the first time in my entire life, your massive financial liabilities are no longer my problem. There was a heavy and suffocating pause on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the rusty gears turning in his head as he tried to decipher my meaning. "Shut up," Jamal finally growled. "You do not know what you are talking about. The company is generating millions. The new price increases are going to double our revenue by the end of the quarter. Chloe and I are taking this brand global." "I am sure you are," I said softly. "Just make sure you read the fine print on your corporate vehicle insurance policy. I hear those custom red leather seats are incredibly expensive to replace if the car gets repossessed by the bank." I did not wait for his inevitable explosion of blinding rage. I simply pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red button to end the call. I placed the phone face down on the cool marble counter and picked up my teacup. The tea was still perfectly warm. Jamal honestly thought he was calling to torture me. He thought he was rubbing my face in his massive unearned success. But all he really did was confirm that my ultimate plan was working perfectly and moving much faster than I had originally anticipated. He was accelerating his own destruction at absolute breakneck speed. Buying that expensive Porsche was the equivalent of drilling a massive hole into the bottom of a ship while standing in the middle of the ocean. He was so incredibly obsessed with looking like a successful tech billionaire that he completely forgot he actually had to run a highly complex software business. The bank algorithms would automatically flag a six-figure luxury car purchase on a corporate credit card, meant exclusively for server hosting and vital software licenses. The sudden drop in operational capital would immediately trigger a manual review of the company financials by our primary lending institution. And when the bank looked closely, they would see the massive wave of client cancellations caused by his ridiculous 40% price hike. They would see that the core engineering team had been entirely replaced by unqualified socialites. They would see a company in a total and complete freefall. I walked back to my living room and opened my laptop. I had an entirely new software platform to launch and a team of brilliant, loyal engineers waiting for my instructions. Jamal could keep the expensive leather chair. He could keep the pastel pink walls, and he could certainly keep the $215,000 sports car. He was going to need a very comfortable place to sit when the entire world came crashing down on his arrogant head. My phone did not even sit on the marble counter for a full 60 seconds before the screen lit up again. The device vibrated violently against the hard stone, buzzing with the desperate and frantic energy of a man who could not stand being dismissed. Jamal was calling back. He was the kind of man who always needed to have the final word, especially against a woman he viewed as his subordinate. I watched the screen flash his name for a few moments, allowing a slow and knowing smile to form on my lips. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the quiet peace of my apartment, before I finally picked up the device and pressed it back to my ear. "Do not you ever hang up the phone on me again, Maya," Jamal screamed the absolute second the line connected. His voice was completely unhinged, stripped of all the smug arrogance from just a minute ago. "I am the chief executive officer of this family and this company. You will treat me with the respect that my position demands. You are nothing but a bitter outsider now." I let him catch his breath, listening to the heavy and erratic sound of his breathing over the phone. The rain continued to gently hit the large glass windows of my living room, creating a soothing background noise that perfectly matched my internal calm. "Are you quite finished, Jamal?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final sentence. Because if you are done throwing a childish tantrum inside your expensive new car, we need to have a very serious conversation about reality. I am living in reality, he snapped back, though his voice wavered just a fraction. I am sitting in a six-figure car paid for by my company. Your company, I repeated slowly, letting the two words hang in the air like a heavy, dark cloud. That is a very fascinating way to look at it. Tell me, Jamal, do you remember the summer of 2019? Do you remember your brilliant idea to start a boutique luxury concierge service? You convinced Dad to co-sign a massive commercial loan for you. You rented out a premium office space in Buckhead, hired a team of expensive personal assistants, and spent an absolute fortune on marketing before you even secured a single paying client. Shut up, Maya, he muttered. But the aggressive bite in his voice was rapidly fading, replaced by the defensive tone of a child being caught in a lie. That was completely different. The market was not ready for my vision. The market was perfectly fine, I replied smoothly. The problem was that you spent the entire operating budget on tailored suits and expensive dinners to make yourself look successful. And when the business inevitably collapsed 6 months later, leaving you with $200,000 in debt and the threat of personal bankruptcy, who exactly did Dad call to fix your mess? He remained completely silent on the other end of the line. Let me refresh your memory. I continued, my tone completely level and devoid of any raw emotion. Dad called me. I was 25 years old. I had just bought my very first property, a modest little duplex that I saved up for by working 80-hour weeks. I was incredibly proud of that duplex. But Dad sat me down at the Sunday dinner table and gave me a long, guilt-inducing speech about family loyalty. He told me about the black tax. He said that as the only successful person in the family, it was my absolute duty to lift my brother up. He begged me to take out a second mortgage on my property, to save you from financial ruin and protect the family name. And because I was young and desperate for my father to love me the way he loved you, I did it. I signed the papers. I took on a massive mountain of your debt so that you could walk away with your pristine reputation completely intact. I paused, letting the heavy weight of the past settle over the phone call. I could hear the faint sound of the Porsche engine idling, but Jamal did not say a single word. I spent the next 4 years eating cheap noodles and skipping vacations just to pay off the bank for a failed business that I had absolutely nothing to do with, I said, my voice growing colder with every single syllable. I paid the black tax in full. I bought your freedom with my own blood and sweat. And now you sit in a car funded by the company I built from the ground up, and you have the absolute audacity to demand my respect. That is all in the past, Jamal finally said, his voice sounding incredibly small and hollow. Dad paid you back eventually. He paid me back 5 years later with zero interest, only after I threatened to take the family to court, I corrected him sharply. But that is exactly my point, Jamal. You have spent your entire life playing the role of a wealthy businessman using other people's money. You love the shiny titles, the fancy cars, and the corner offices. But you have absolutely no idea how to actually build a foundation. You are playing a very dangerous game with a highly complex logistics software company, and you are completely blind to the rules. I know exactly what I am doing, he fired back desperately, trying to regain his shattered confidence. Chloe and I have a solid transition plan. The new profit margins will cover the loss of any clients who refuse to accept the price hike. You are just trying to make me paranoid. I am not trying to make you paranoid, Jamal, I said softly. I am simply giving you a friendly warning because I will no longer be there to catch you when you fall. You and Dad were so incredibly focused on stealing my executive title that you completely forgot to look under the hood of the car you were stealing. Aura Glowtech is a software company. The only thing that truly holds any financial value is the intellectual property, the algorithms, the actual code that runs the platform. Have you bothered to check the registration documents for those patents yet? Have you looked at the software licensing agreements we signed with our top vendors? What are you talking about? Jamal demanded, a sudden thread of genuine panic weaving its way into his voice. The intellectual property belongs to the company. Dad owns the holding company, which means we own the code. I let out a soft and melodic laugh, that seemed to echo through the quiet apartment. "Oh, Jamal," I whispered, sounding almost sympathetic to his extreme ignorance. "You really should have hired your own corporate attorney instead of relying on Dad's outdated legal advice. I highly suggest you go into the office tomorrow morning and open the bottom drawer of the executive filing cabinet. Look for a blue folder labeled IP Registration and Licensing. Read it very carefully. And when the corporate auditors inevitably come knocking on your door to investigate your sudden six-figure vehicle purchase, I want you to remember this exact conversation." "Wait. Maya, what exactly did you do?" Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with undeniable fear. "Maya, answer me. What is in that folder?" I took a slow, deep breath, feeling a massive weight completely lift off my shoulders. I was finally completely free from the toxic cycle. "Enjoy the new Porsche, Jamal," I said, my voice completely serene and untroubled. "Drive it fast because you are not going to be able to keep it for very long." I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the screen to end the call. I immediately opened my settings and blocked his phone number. I blocked Chloe. I blocked my father. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I walked over to the large windows and looked out at the city lights beginning to glow through the rain. I had just planted the ultimate seed of destruction in Jamal's mind. He was going to spend the entire night tossing and turning in complete agony, wondering what massive legal trap he had just blindly walked into. And the best part was that I did not even have to do anything else to ruin him. I just had to sit back, drink my tea, and watch my arrogant brother completely destroy himself from the inside out. Exactly 5 days after our tense phone conversation regarding his luxury vehicle purchase, Jamal stepped out of the private elevator and walked into the penthouse suite of Oraglow Tech. It was a crisp Tuesday morning in Atlanta. Jamal was wearing a custom-tailored three-piece suit that cost more than most people made in a month. He strutted down the hallway with his chest puffed out desperately, trying to project the image of a seasoned tech titan. But the heavy dark circles under his eyes told an entirely different story. My cryptic warning about the intellectual property patents had severely disrupted his sleep schedule. He had spent the entire weekend desperately digging through filing cabinets and digital archives, trying to figure out what legal trap I had set for him. When he found absolutely nothing obvious, he convinced himself that I was just making empty threats out of pure jealousy. He pushed the anxiety deep down into his stomach and fueled his massive ego with 3 shots of premium espresso. He walked into his newly renovated corner office. The room was utterly ridiculous. The highly practical and ergonomic workstations I had originally purchased were completely gone. In their place sat imported Italian leather couches, a massive custom-built mahogany wet bar, and a ridiculous abstract sculpture that served absolutely no functional purpose. It looked like the VIP lounge of a pretentious nightclub rather than the operational headquarters of a highly complex software logistics firm. Jamal sat down in his oversized executive chair and cracked his knuckles. He opened his incredibly expensive laptop, fully expecting to see a beautiful dashboard showing the daily revenue reports reflecting his brilliant 40% price hike. He expected to see a sea of green numbers validating his aggressive business strategy and proving to our father that he was indeed a visionary leader. Instead, the moment the screen illuminated, he saw a flashing red notification from the corporate secure email server. Then another red notification popped up. And then another. Within 10 seconds, the upper right corner of his screen was completely covered in urgent alerts. His inbox was not just active, it was completely exploding. But these were not new client signups or congratulations from wealthy venture capitalists. They were automated legal notices forwarded from the compliance department. Jamal felt a cold bead of sweat form at the base of his neck. He quickly clicked on the first email marked with a high-priority red exclamation point. It was from the Chief Legal Counsel of Apex Global Freight. They were our absolute largest shipping partner, handling over 60% of our domestic supply chain routes across the country. The subject line was written in all capital letters and read, "Immediate contract termination and cease of operations." Jamal felt his heart completely drop into his stomach. He leaned closer to the screen, reading the dense legal text as his breathing became shallow and erratic. The email cited a clear and undeniable breach of service-level agreements. It detailed a total failure on our end to maintain operational standards over the past 3 weeks. But the absolute killing blow was buried deep in the second paragraph. The lawyers for Apex Global were officially invoking the transition clause. They stated clearly that due to the sudden and unannounced departure of the primary technical liaison, they no longer had any confidence in the security and the reliability of the Oraglow platform. I was the primary technical liaison. I was the one who built the system architecture they trusted. Without me in the building, they viewed the software as a massive liability. Jamal frantically clicked out of the email and opened the next urgent message. It was from Horizon Logistics, our second largest dedicated carrier network. The subject line was identical: immediate termination effective at noon today. His hand began to shake violently as he dragged the mouse down to the third email. It was from Zenith Supply Solutions, our primary warehousing and fulfillment partner on the East Coast. Immediate termination, pending legal review of software licensing. Within the agonizing span of 45 seconds, Jamal realized that the top 3 foundational partners of Oraglow Tech had officially pulled their massive contracts. These 3 companies alone represented 80% of our daily operational volume. Without their trucks, their warehouses, and their shipping routes, the Oraglow software was essentially a completely useless digital dashboard. It was a beautifully designed GPS system with absolutely no cars to track. The company had just been decapitated. Jamal jumped up from his chair so fast that his knee slammed into the heavy glass desk. His hand hit his coffee cup, sending dark artisanal espresso spilling all over the pristine surface and dripping onto the expensive imported rug. He did not even care. He stared at the screen as more cancellation emails from smaller subcontractors began to flood the inbox, following the lead of the major players. The panic rising in his chest was absolute and consuming. "Chloe," he screamed at the top of his lungs. His voice echoed down the quiet hallway, cracking with genuine terror. "Chloe, get in here right now." A few seconds later, Chloe burst through the heavy office doors holding a thick stack of pastel pink marketing brochures. She looked incredibly annoyed that her morning routine had been interrupted. "What is wrong, Jamal?" she asked, placing a hand on her hip, completely oblivious to the massive corporate fire burning down around them. "I am in the middle of picking out the new fonts for our holiday social media campaign." Jamal spun his laptop around aggressively, pointing a shaking finger at the screen. "Look at this!" he yelled, his voice high-pitched and hysterical. "The logistics partners are pulling out. All of them. Apex, Horizon, Zenith. They are terminating the contracts today. The entire supply chain is collapsing. We have no carriers." Chloe stepped closer and stared at the screen. Her eyes went wide, but there was absolutely zero professional comprehension in her gaze. She did not know how to read a corporate termination notice. She did not understand the massive legal and financial implications of a breached service-level agreement. She looked at the flashing red alerts and then looked back at Jamal with a blank, terrified expression. "Well, we just need to calm them down," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to apply her utterly useless brand management logic to a hard operational crisis. "Let us just send them a luxury gift basket. We can send them some expensive wine and maybe a 20% discount code for next month to win them back. A nice apology email should fix this, right?" "A discount code," Jamal whispered, staring at his wife like she had suddenly grown a second head. He realized in that exact horrifying moment that the executive vice president of brand management he had so proudly appointed was completely and entirely useless in a real corporate crisis. She could not write a single line of code. She could not negotiate complex supply chain routes. She could not call the executives at Apex Global and speak their highly technical language to calm them down. She was nothing but a very expensive decoration. Before Jamal could scream at her, the multi-line phone on his desk began to ring loudly. The caller identification showed it was the head of the accounting department. It was a terrified young woman named Sarah, who had been prematurely promoted after Chloe recklessly fired my senior financial controller. Jamal snatched the receiver off the base. "What is it?" he barked, desperately wiping the sweat from his forehead. "Mr. CEO," Sarah said, her voice shaking uncontrollably on the other end of the line. The automated clearinghouse system just completely froze. Because our three main partners suddenly terminated their vendor contracts, the primary payment gateways automatically flagged the AuraGlow operating accounts for highly suspicious activity and a massive sudden loss of guaranteed revenue. "What exactly does that mean?" Jamal demanded, gripping the phone so hard his knuckles turned completely white. "It means the corporate bank accounts are locked pending a full risk assessment by the Commercial Lending Board," Sarah explained, sounding like she was on the verge of tears. "We cannot process any incoming client payments. But worse than that, we cannot send any money out. The accounts are completely frozen." Jamal felt all the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him dizzy and nauseous. The accounts were frozen. That meant absolutely no money could come in and no money could go out. He thought about the massive employee payroll that was due on Friday. He thought about the astronomical premium office lease he had just signed to expand our square footage. And then a wave of pure paralyzing terror hit him. He thought about the $250,000 sports car he had just charged to the corporate platinum card. A card that was directly tied to the exact bank accounts that were now locked down under a fraud and risk investigation. The shiny facade of his fake tech empire was melting off his face in real time. The expensive walls of the corner office seemed to rapidly close in on him, suffocating him. He looked at Chloe, who was now frantically scrolling through her phone, probably trying to call her country club friends for completely useless advice. He looked at the spilled coffee dripping onto the floor, and for the very first time in his arrogant and entitled life, Jamal realized that I was not just a bitter sister making empty threats. I was completely right. He was sitting behind the wheel of a massive complex machine, going 100 miles an hour toward a brick wall, and he just realized he had absolutely no idea where the brakes were. It was exactly 2 hours after the catastrophic banking freeze when Jamal finally figured out where I was hiding. I was sitting comfortably at my sleek white desk in my brand new state-of-the-art office space located right in the heart of Midtown Atlanta. The warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the immaculate floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating a workspace that hummed with absolute efficiency and quiet focus. From my vantage point behind my desk, I had a clear line of sight through my thick glass office door straight out into the main bullpen area. The environment was completely peaceful. Suddenly, that serene atmosphere was violently shattered. The heavy glass door at the front entrance of my corporate suite was yanked open with such massive aggressive force that it slammed hard against the metal wall stopper. The loud crash echoed across the entire floor. Jamal stood in the doorway, breathing heavily like a wild animal. His incredibly expensive three-piece suit was completely disheveled. His silk tie was pulled loose, his collar was unbuttoned, and dark patches of sweat stained the fabric under his arms. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon through a literal hurricane. He stormed past the front reception desk, completely ignoring my incredibly confused security guard, who was already reaching for his radio. But as Jamal marched angrily through the center of the main floor, his aggressive footsteps suddenly slowed to an absolute crawl. He stopped dead in his tracks right in the middle of the aisle. His wide, panicked eyes darted rapidly across the room, scanning the rows of modern ergonomic desks. Sitting at those desks, working diligently, were the exact same people Chloe had ruthlessly fired over the past 3 weeks. There was Marcus, my brilliant lead developer, typing rapidly on 2 massive high-definition monitors. There was my entire senior logistics team analyzing supply chain routes on the newly installed digital whiteboards. There was the core client relations staff quietly answering phone calls and managing technical support tickets. Jamal looked like he had just walked right into the Twilight Zone. His jaw literally dropped open. He was staring directly at the ghosts of the empire he had foolishly destroyed. Jamal snapped out of his total shock and redirected his blinding rage toward my private office. He marched right up to my heavy glass door and began pounding his flat palms against it. The loud, heavy thuds vibrated through the quiet office, causing several of my engineers to stop what they were doing. Marcus stood up from his desk, looking completely ready to intervene and remove my brother from the premises, but I caught his eye and gave him a gentle, reassuring nod, indicating that I had the situation completely under control. I reached out and pressed the small button under my desk to electronically unlock the door. Jamal burst into my private office, pacing back and forth across the carpet like a trapped predator. "You set me up!" he screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with raw desperation. "You planned this entire massive collapse from the very beginning, Maya. You stole my employees, and you poached my absolute biggest clients." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, resting my hands calmly on my lap. I did not raise my voice to match his chaotic and unhinged energy. "You need to lower your voice, Jamal," I said, my tone perfectly level and completely unbothered. "You are currently trespassing in a private corporate facility, and you are disturbing my highly productive staff. I am talking about the exact same staff that your wife fired because they did not match her ridiculous pastel color palette. Do not play these childish mind games with me, Maya," he barked, slamming both of his heavy hands down on the pristine surface of my desk. Apex Global and Horizon Logistics just terminated their massive vendor contracts. They pulled out on the exact same day. And now my corporate bank accounts are entirely frozen because of the sudden drop in guaranteed revenue. You called them, did you not? You told them to cancel their corporate accounts so you could steal them for this pathetic new startup of yours. He leaned closer to my face, his eyes wide and completely manic. "I am going to sue you for every single penny you are worth." He threatened, his voice shaking with absolute fury. "I am going to bury you in so much corporate litigation that you will never be able to work in the tech industry again. I will personally drag you into federal court for corporate espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and tortious interference. I will make sure Dad takes your house." I let him finish his massive legal threat, simply watching the large purple vein pulsing angrily on the side of his forehead. "I am absolutely terrified, Jamal," I replied, my tone completely flat and heavily laced with pure sarcasm. "But before you call your expensive boutique lawyers, you might want to actually look up the legal definition of tortious interference. Because I did not steal a single client from Oraglow Tech. I did not make a single phone call to the executives at Apex Global or Horizon Logistics to convince them to leave you." I stood up slowly, taking my time as I walked around the edge of my desk until I was standing just 3 feet away from my older brother. "They left entirely on their own," Jamal, I explained, speaking incredibly slowly as if I were teaching a very difficult mathematical concept to a small, confused child. "They left because they run highly complex, multi-million-dollar shipping routes across the entire country. They absolutely require a stable, secure, and highly managed software architecture to track their massive freight fleets. When they realized that the primary technical architect was no longer with the company, and that the new chief executive officer was busy buying luxury sports cars and raising prices by 40%, they did what any intelligent corporate entity would do. They mitigated their extreme financial risk. They pulled the plug on your sinking ship to save their own cargo." Jamal shook his head back and forth in complete denial, taking a small step back from me. "And what about them?" he demanded, pointing a shaking finger back toward the glass door in the main office floor. "Are you going to stand there and tell me you did not illegally poach my entire engineering department?" "I did not poach anyone, Jamal," I said, crossing my arms over my chest and staring directly into his panicked eyes. "Chloe fired them. She handed them official termination papers and had security forcefully escort them out of the building. You cannot sue someone for hiring highly qualified, unemployed tech talent. I simply offered them a safe harbor and a massive pay raise after you and your completely incompetent wife violently threw them overboard into the ocean." "No," he stammered, his false arrogance finally giving way to raw, undiluted terror. "No, you are lying to me. You orchestrated this entire collapse to make me look completely incompetent. Dad is going to hear all about this, Maya. When I tell him that you deliberately sabotaged the family business out of pure spite, he is going to make sure you are completely ruined. He is going to disown you permanently. You can run home and tell Dad whatever you want, Jamal." I said, my voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper. But Dad cannot magically unfreeze your commercial bank accounts. Dad cannot force a massive logistics corporation to trust a man who has absolutely zero technical experience and a history of extreme financial failure. You wanted the heavy crown, Jamal. You begged for the massive responsibility. You sat in that boardroom and told me that I was far too emotional to handle the big leagues. Well, the big leagues are calling your phone right now. I highly suggest you go back to your ridiculous pastel pink office and figure out exactly how to answer them. Because screaming at me in my office is not going to put a single dollar back into your frozen bank accounts. Jamal stood frozen in the center of my office. His chest heaved up and down as he struggled to process the devastating reality I had just laid out in front of him. He shook his head violently, refusing to accept defeat. That is completely impossible, he stammered, his voice lacking any of the aggressive authority he had tried to project just a few minutes earlier. Dad owns the limited liability company. He has the original incorporation documents from 10 years ago. That means the company owns the contracts. You cannot just magically take them with you, Maya. That is not how corporate law works. I felt a deep sense of pity mixed with absolute triumph as I looked at my older brother. He was a man who had spent his entire adult life pretending to be a business expert while completely ignoring the actual mechanics of how a successful enterprise functions. I turned away from him and walked back to my desk. I reached down and unlocked the bottom drawer, pulling out a thick, heavy stack of bound legal documents. These were the master service agreements I had personally drafted and negotiated with our top logistics partners. I lifted the massive stack of papers and tossed them onto the pristine white surface of my desk. The documents landed with a loud, heavy thud that echoed sharply in the quiet office, making Jamal physically flinch. I suggest you come over here and read paragraph 7, section 4 of the Master Service Agreement, Jamal, I said, gesturing calmly toward the stack of papers. But since I know you have absolutely no patience for reading complex legal text, I will be happy to summarize it for you. Jamal took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the thick documents as if they were a live explosive device. He did not reach for them. He just stood there staring at the paper while a fresh bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face. When Dad loaned me that initial $50,000 10 years ago, he insisted on owning the holding company, I explained, keeping my voice slow and methodical. He thought he was being incredibly smart. He thought he was securing a massive financial asset for the family. And for the first few years, he was absolutely right. The company name and the corporate tax structure belonged to him. But 3 years ago, when Oraglow Tech started scaling rapidly, and we began negotiating multi-million-dollar shipping routes with massive national carriers, I realized I had a massive vulnerability. I knew that eventually you and Dad would try to take the company away from me. It was not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Jamal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. He reached up and wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand. So I protected myself. I continued leaning forward and resting my hands on the desk. When I sat down with the executive board of Apex Global and Horizon Logistics, they were extremely impressed with my software architecture. But they were also highly cautious corporate entities. They wanted absolute assurance that the visionary who built the platform would remain in direct operational control. They demanded stability. So my corporate attorney and I introduced a very specific legal provision into every single major contract we signed. It is a standard provision in high-level venture capital and enterprise logistics. It is called the Key Man Clause. Jamal stared at me blankly, clearly unfamiliar with the terminology. What does that mean? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. It means that those massive logistics companies did not sign a contract with Reginald's limited liability company, I said, articulating every single word with razor-sharp precision. They did not sign a contract with a faceless corporate entity known as Oraglow Tech. They signed those contracts explicitly and entirely contingent upon my continuous employment as the chief executive officer. The Key Man Clause strictly dictates that if I am removed, fired, or forced to resign from my executive position for any reason whatsoever, the contracts are immediately rendered null and void. The partners have the absolute legal right to terminate the service agreements without any financial penalty and without any prior notice. The color completely drained from Jamal's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His knees visibly buckled for a fraction of a second, and he had to grab the back of one of my guest chairs just to keep himself standing upright. He was finally beginning to understand the massive scale of his own destruction. "You triggered the clause, Jamal," I said, offering him a cold and unforgiving smile. "When you and Dad cornered me in that boardroom 3 weeks ago and forced me to sign that resignation paper, you thought you were executing a brilliant corporate takeover. You thought you were stealing my crown. But what you actually did was legally authorize the immediate termination of 80% of your guaranteed revenue. You did not just take the driver's seat of the company, Jamal. You completely ripped the engine out of the car and threw it straight into the garbage. And then you bought a $215,000 sports car using a corporate bank account that you had just permanently destroyed." Jamal began breathing heavily again, but this time it was not out of anger. It was the rapid, shallow breathing of a man experiencing a severe and absolute panic attack. He clutched his chest, his expensive silk tie now looking like a noose around his neck. The sweat was pouring down his face, soaking into his pristine collar. He looked frantically around my beautiful new office, at the brilliant employees working quietly outside the glass, at the heavy legal documents sitting on my desk. He was completely trapped in a nightmare of his own arrogant creation. "You have to fix this, Maya," he pleaded, his voice cracking pitifully. "You have to call them back. You have to tell them it was just a temporary transition. Tell them you are still consulting for the company. If the bank accounts stay frozen through the weekend, the corporate lenders are going to initiate a massive audit. They will see the car purchase. They will see the terrible profit margins." Dad put the family house up as collateral for the new commercial office lease. If the company defaults on that lease, the bank will take Dad's house, Maya. "You cannot do this to our family." "I am not doing anything to our family, Jamal," I replied, my tone remaining completely calm and detached. "I am simply sitting in my office running my new software company. You and Dad are the ones who decided I was no longer necessary. You are the ones who wanted aggressive masculine leadership. Well, now you have it. You are the chief executive officer. It is your job to navigate the commercial audits, the frozen bank accounts, and the massive impending corporate default." I walked back around my desk and sat down in my comfortable leather chair, turning my attention back to my computer monitors. "I have a very important strategy meeting with Marcus in 5 minutes," I said, dismissing him entirely without even looking back up. "You have exactly 30 seconds to walk out of my corporate suite before I instruct my security team to physically remove you for trespassing. I suggest you use that time to call a very good bankruptcy lawyer. You are going to need one by tomorrow morning." Jamal stumbled out of my office, looking like a hollow shell of a man. The heavy glass door clicked shut behind him, sealing him out of my new world and trapping him in his own collapsing reality. I took a deep breath and immediately returned my attention to my dual monitors, jumping right back into the strategy meeting with Marcus, as if my brother had never even entered the building. We had a new software platform to launch, and I refused to let Jamal waste another single minute of my valuable time. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening when the rest of my staff finally packed up and headed home. I was the only person left in the quiet corporate suite. The sun had completely set over Atlanta, leaving my office bathed in the soft blue glow of my computer screens. I was just reaching for my coat when the sharp buzzing of my cell phone broke the absolute silence of the room. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed the name Reginald, my father. Jamal had obviously run straight back to the family mansion to cry to our father about the massive corporate disaster. I picked up the phone, but before I answered, I tapped the screen and activated the secure call recording application I had installed weeks ago. I knew exactly how my father operated. I knew he would try to twist the narrative, and I wanted a complete audio record of his desperate manipulation. I swiped the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Maya," my father barked the moment the line connected. His voice was incredibly loud, echoing through the quiet office. I did not say a word. I just sat back in my leather chair, letting the bright light of the phone screen illuminate my face in the dark room. "What exactly is wrong with you?" he demanded, his tone thick with self-righteous anger. "Jamal just came to my house in absolute tears. He told me that you maliciously contacted our shipping partners and manipulated them into terminating their vendor contracts. He told me that you are trying to bankrupt the company out of pure spite just because I promoted your brother. I knew you were acting entirely too emotional lately, but I never thought you were capable of this level of petty, vindictive sabotage. You are actively destroying the family legacy, Maya." The sheer audacity of his words was almost breathtaking. Even when presented with the absolute undeniable failure of his golden child, my father still found a way to make it my fault. He completely ignored the fact that Jamal had raised our prices by 40% without any market research. He completely ignored the fact that Jamal had fired our entire senior engineering team, and he most certainly ignored the fact that his brilliant son had just purchased a $250,000 sports car on a frozen corporate credit card. In my father's twisted mind, Jamal was the innocent victim and I was the wicked villain. "Did Jamal happen to mention the key man clause, Dad?" I asked, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any defensive emotion. "Do not try to confuse me with your useless legal jargon, Maya," he snapped back aggressively. "Jamal explained everything to me. He said you tricked those companies into signing a biased contract that only benefits you. You deliberately set a trap for your own family. After everything I have done for you, after I gave you the seed money to start this business when you were just a struggling college graduate, this is how you repay my generosity, by trying to steal my company and ruin your brother. You are incredibly selfish and ungrateful." I listened to his toxic words pouring through the speaker, but for the very first time in my 32 years of life, they did not hurt me. They did not make me feel guilty. They did not make me question my own worth. I recognized the tactic exactly for what it was. It was pure textbook gaslighting. My father was trying to rewrite reality to protect his fragile ego and shield Jamal from the massive consequences of his own staggering incompetence. "You need to fix this right now." "Maya," my father commanded, his voice dropping into the deep, authoritative register he used when he expected absolute obedience. "You are going to call those logistics partners first thing tomorrow morning. You are going to tell them that you had a temporary emotional breakdown and that you are fully supporting Jamal as the chief executive officer. You are going to waive that ridiculous contract clause and beg them to reinstate the service agreements. If you do not fix this, the bank is going to default on the commercial lease and they could take my house. You are putting your own parents on the street because you cannot handle sharing the spotlight with your brother." I let him rant for another 2 full minutes. I let him hurl every single insult and accusation he could think of. I let him call me a terrible daughter, a bitter woman, and a disgrace to the family name. I remained completely silent, recording every single toxic syllable from my own personal archives. I wanted to remember this exact moment forever. I wanted to remember the exact sound of the chains breaking. "Are you quite finished, Dad?" I finally asked, cutting through his aggressive monologue with a voice so incredibly cold it could freeze water. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "Do not take that disrespectful tone with me," he warned defensively. "I am your father and you will do exactly as I say. You owe this family, Maya." "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. "I paid back your $50,000 loan 8 years ago with 20% interest. I paid off Jamal's massive gambling debts. I built a $10 million company with my own bare hands while you and Jamal sat back and took all the credit. I do not owe you my time, my money, or my intellectual property. You wanted a company run by a real man. Well, you have one now. I highly suggest." 2 weeks passed since that tense phone call with my father, and the corporate bleeding at Origlow Tech had only continued to accelerate. The fourth Thursday of November finally arrived, bringing with it the annual family Thanksgiving dinner. In my family, Thanksgiving was never just a simple holiday meal. It was a massive theatrical production carefully designed to showcase our supposed wealth and status to the rest of the extended family. My father insisted on hosting it every single year at his sprawling six-bedroom mansion in the highly prestigious Buckhead neighborhood of Atlanta. I could have easily stayed home in my quiet apartment or booked a luxury flight to a tropical island. I had absolutely no obligation to subject myself to their toxic environment. But I chose to attend. I wanted a front row seat to the final act of the play they had written for themselves. I spent the entire afternoon getting ready, making sure I looked absolutely flawless. I wore a stunning crimson red silk dress that perfectly complemented my skin tone. My hair was styled in sleek, flawless waves, and my makeup was understated but incredibly elegant. I looked well-rested, deeply hydrated, and completely unbothered by the massive corporate war happening in the background. I pulled my car into the long circular driveway of my father's estate. The massive brick house looked incredibly imposing with its tall white columns and perfectly manicured landscaping. Looking at the beautiful facade, you would never guess that the man who owned it had just leveraged it against a commercial office lease that was currently on the verge of massive default. I grabbed an expensive bottle of vintage red wine from the passenger seat and walked up the wide stone steps. I pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand marble foyer. Instantly, the rich and comforting aroma of traditional soul food hit the air. The smell was incredible. I could detect the savory scent of baked macaroni and cheese with the perfect golden crust. There was the deep, earthy aroma of slow-cooked collard greens simmering with smoked turkey wings. I could smell the sweet potato casserole topped with toasted marshmallows and the warm spice of homemade peach cobbler baking in the oven. Through the large archway, I could see the massive dining room table groaning under the weight of an extravagant holiday feast centered around a beautifully roasted 30-pound turkey. But the moment my expensive heels clicked against the polished marble floor, the loud and boisterous conversations of my extended family came to an immediate and dead halt. It was as if someone had suddenly pulled the power cord on a loud stereo system. The silence that fell over the massive house was thick, heavy, and incredibly awkward. I walked gracefully into the formal living room where at least 20 of my relatives were gathered. There were my aunts, uncles, and a dozen cousins holding crystal glasses of sweet tea and expensive bourbon. Every single face turned to look at me. The eyes staring back at me were completely filled with heavy judgment and barely concealed hostility. There were no warm smiles. There were no excited greetings. It was incredibly obvious that Jamal and my father had spent the last 14 days running a massive and highly coordinated smear campaign against me. They had clearly called every single aunt, uncle, and cousin to spin a completely fabricated narrative to protect their own fragile egos. In their twisted version of the story, I was the bitter and intensely jealous sister who threw a massive temper tantrum after being rightfully demoted by the family patriarch. They had undoubtedly told the entire family that I maliciously sabotaged the logistics software and illegally stole all the corporate clients just to punish my brother for his success. They painted me as a greedy traitor who was actively trying to bankrupt our father and destroy the family legacy. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone! I said, my voice bright, melodic, and completely unshaken by the cold reception. Nobody moved to hug me. My Aunt Beatrice, a woman who thrived on family gossip and always favored Jamal, simply took a slow sip of her wine and looked me up and down with deep disapproval. "Well, look who finally decided to show her face," Aunt Beatrice muttered just loud enough for the entire room to hear. I offered her a brilliant smile. "It is wonderful to see you too, Aunt Beatrice," I replied smoothly, refusing to take the bait. I scanned the room and quickly located the two people responsible for this incredibly hostile atmosphere. Chloe was standing near the expensive wet bar in the corner. She looked absolutely exhausted and completely out of her element. Her usually perfect blonde hair was pulled back into a messy bun, and her designer dress looked slightly wrinkled. She forced a tight plastic smile onto her face when she made eye contact with me, but her eyes were full of deep, underlying panic. Jamal looked even worse. He was standing next to the fireplace nursing a glass of dark liquor. The expensive custom-tailored suit he wore could not hide the massive physical toll the last 2 weeks had taken on his body. He looked like he had aged 5 years in 14 days. The dark bags under his eyes were prominent, and his posture was completely defeated. He stared at me with a mixture of absolute hatred and raw terror. The frozen corporate bank accounts, the angry logistics partners, and the massive impending payroll were clearly crushing the life out of him. He was drowning in the deep end of the pool, and he knew that I was the only person who knew how to swim. My father Reginald sat at the absolute head of the long dining room table. He looked like a highly stressed king trying to maintain control over a rapidly sinking castle. He gave me a tight, forced nod as I walked into the dining area and set the expensive bottle of wine on the polished mahogany table. "Have a seat, Maya," he commanded, his voice lacking its usual booming authority. "We were just about to carve the turkey." I took my seat near the middle of the table, surrounded by cousins who actively avoided making eye contact with me. As the food was passed around, the clinking of heavy silver forks against fine china was the only consistent sound in the room. The tension was so thick you could practically cut it with a butter knife. The usual joyful holiday banter was completely replaced by a suffocating passive-aggressive energy. Aunt Beatrice leaned over her plate of collard greens and looked directly at me. "It is just such a massive shame when siblings cannot support each other," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sadness. "Family is supposed to stick together and build each other up, not tear each other down out of pure jealousy." A murmur of agreement rippled down the table. Several aunts and uncles nodded their heads, casting dark, judgmental glances in my direction. Jamal looked down at his plate, a smug but highly nervous expression crossing his face. He thought the family pressure would finally break me. He thought sitting in a room full of people who hated me would force me to apologize and fix his massive corporate disaster. I slowly wiped my mouth with a linen napkin and looked directly at Aunt Beatrice. "I completely agree, Aunt Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly calm and remarkably polite. "Support is incredibly important. In fact, I have supported Jamal through 2 failed business ventures and a massive gambling debt over the last 10 years. I think it is finally time he learns how to support himself. Don't you agree?" The entire table went completely silent again. Aunt Beatrice opened her mouth to speak but quickly closed it, looking completely scandalized by my direct honesty. Jamal's face flushed a deep, angry red. He gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned white. My father cleared his throat loudly, desperately trying to shift the energy in the room before the ugly truth of his golden child was completely exposed to the extended family. "Let us just focus on the food," my father said, his voice tight with extreme warning. "We have a lot to be thankful for this year. Jamal has taken on a massive new responsibility as Chief Executive Officer, and he is navigating some highly complex transitional challenges. We are all very proud of him." I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against their silent accusations. I simply picked up my fork and took a bite of the sweet potato casserole. It tasted absolutely delicious. My absolute refusal to look guilty, ashamed, or intimidated was driving them completely insane. I sat at that massive table looking radiant and successful, while the 2 men who tried to destroy me were slowly suffocating under the weight of their own lies. The fake Thanksgiving atmosphere was thick with resentment, but for the very first time in my life, I was not the one choking on it. "You and Jamal figure out how to unfreeze those corporate bank accounts before Friday, because the commercial lenders are not going to care about your fragile ego. Maya, if you hang up this phone, you are no longer a part of this family," my father shouted, his voice cracking with genuine panic as he realized his manipulation tactics were completely failing. "I will disown you. I will cut you out of the will. You will have absolutely nothing." "I already have everything I need," I said softly. "Good luck with the corporate audit, Dad. I hear they are incredibly thorough." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, ending the call abruptly. I did not block his number this time. I wanted him to have the ability to leave desperate voicemails over the next few weeks as his precious empire rapidly burned to the ground. I saved the audio recording to a secure cloud server, backing it up in 3 different locations. Then I slipped my phone into my pocket, grabbed my designer coat, and walked out of my beautiful new office. As I rode the elevator down to the lobby, I felt an overwhelming sense of profound peace. My father thought he was threatening me with the ultimate punishment by kicking me out of the family. He completely failed to realize that being exiled from their toxic dynamic was the exact prize I had been fighting for my entire life. They could keep their empty titles, their frozen bank accounts, and their massive impending debt. I was finally completely free, and I was never looking back. The main course was finally cleared away by the hired catering staff. Small plates of warm peach cobbler and slices of sweet potato pie were placed meticulously in front of each guest. Usually, this was the exact moment in the evening when the tension would finally begin to dissipate. It was the time for loose laughter, comfortable conversation, and the loosening of belts. But tonight, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere had only intensified. The air in the formal dining room was so incredibly thick with unsaid accusations and bitter resentment that it felt difficult to breathe. My father stood up slowly from his massive chair at the head of the table. He picked up his crystal wine glass and tapped the side of it with a heavy silver spoon. The sharp ringing sound cut through the quiet murmurs of the extended family, instantly demanding their absolute attention. All eyes turned toward the patriarch of the family. Reginald stood tall, his posture rigid, his jaw set in a hard, unforgiving line. He looked around the table, making deliberate eye contact with his brothers, sisters, and nieces before his gaze finally locked directly onto me. His eyes were cold and completely devoid of any paternal warmth. Before we enjoy this incredible dessert, my father began, his deep voice carrying easily across the large room. I want to take a moment to express exactly what I am thankful for this year. Family has always been the absolute cornerstone of my life. It is the foundation of our legacy. We are a family that builds together, that struggles together, and that protects one another against the harsh realities of the outside world. He paused dramatically, taking a small sip of his expensive red wine. His words sounded perfectly noble on the surface, but everyone at the table knew exactly what was coming. The entire speech was heavily loaded with unspoken venom, carefully designed to isolate me. This year has brought massive changes to our family business. He continued, his voice growing louder and more forceful. As you all know, I recently passed the torch of leadership at Oraglow Tech to my son Jamal. I did this because the company needed true vision. It needed strong, aggressive leadership to navigate the highly competitive tech landscape. And Jamal stepped up to that massive challenge without a single moment of hesitation. He took on the incredible burden of securing our family legacy for the next generation. A quiet murmur of approval rippled down the sides of the table. Aunt Beatrice nodded her head vigorously, raising her glass slightly in Jamal's direction. Chloe reached over and squeezed Jamal's hand, putting on a completely fake display of supportive affection. Jamal sat up a little straighter, his chest puffing out slightly as he absorbed the unearned praise. But I could see the tiny bead of sweat forming at his temple. He knew the absolute truth behind the facade. Unfortunately, my father said, his tone suddenly dropping into a register of deep theatrical disappointment. Not everyone in this room understands the true meaning of family loyalty. Some people are so entirely consumed by their own selfish ambition that they would rather see the family empire burn to the ground than see their own flesh and blood succeed. He placed his wine glass down on the table with a heavy, deliberate thud. He gripped the back of his chair with both hands, leaning forward slightly. He raised his right hand and pointed a long, accusing finger directly at me. The gesture was so incredibly aggressive and public that several cousins actually gasped out loud. "I am talking about you, Maya!" My father shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the dining room. "You sat at this very table for years pretending to be a dutiful daughter, while you secretly plotted against your own brother. When I made the difficult executive decision to restructure the company, you did not support your family. You threw a massive vindictive temper tantrum. You deliberately sabotaged the software architecture. You manipulated our biggest logistics partners into canceling their massive corporate contracts. You intentionally froze our commercial bank accounts out of pure spite." The entire dining room erupted into shocked whispers. Aunts and uncles covered their mouths in exaggerated horror. They looked at me as if I had just confessed to a terrible violent crime. My father was weaponizing their ignorance, feeding them a completely fabricated narrative to turn the entire bloodline against me. He was using the sacred Thanksgiving dinner table as a massive public tribunal, and he was acting as the judge, jury, and executioner. You are actively trying to bankrupt the company that I financed. My father continued, his face turning a deep shade of angry red. You are putting my house, my legacy, and your brother's future in absolute jeopardy simply because you could not handle stepping out of the spotlight. You are a bitter, selfish, and incredibly ungrateful woman, Maya. I did not flinch under his massive verbal assault. I did not look away. I kept my posture perfectly straight, resting my hands calmly in my lap. I let him pour all of his toxic rage out into the open for everyone to see. I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to fix the massive, catastrophic mess you intentionally created, he yelled, his voice shaking with absolute fury. Jamal has been working around the clock, desperately trying to save the business from your malicious sabotage. He is a true hero for standing strong against your corporate terrorism. But I will not allow you to hold this family hostage any longer. My father stood up to his full height, looking down at me with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. I spoke with my estate lawyers yesterday morning. He announced, his words dropping like heavy lead weights onto the silent table. I am officially cutting you out of my will entirely, Maya. You will not receive a single penny of my estate. You will not receive a single share of the family business. I am completely disowning you. You are no longer welcome in my house. You are no longer my daughter. A collective gasp swept through the dining room. Disownment was the absolute ultimate punishment in our family. It was a complete severing of all financial and emotional ties. Aunt Beatrice looked at me with an expression of pure morbid fascination, waiting for me to completely break down and start sobbing. Chloe looked incredibly smug, clearly believing she had finally won the long, bitter war against me. Jamal looked down at his plate, unable to meet my eyes, his guilt and terror warring with his massive ego. My father stood at the head of the table, breathing heavily, waiting for my inevitable breakdown. He expected me to fall to my knees. He expected me to beg for his forgiveness, to promise that I would call the logistics partners and fix the massive corporate disaster. He expected me to sacrifice my entire life to save his fragile pride, just like I had always done in the past. But I did not cry. I did not beg. I simply reached for my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth with absolute perfect grace. I placed the napkin neatly on the table next to my untouched slice of peach cobbler. I looked around the room, making direct eye contact with every single relative who had just silently condemned me based on my father's ridiculous lies. And then I looked back at the man who had just publicly disowned me. Are you quite finished with your ridiculous performance, Dad? I asked, my voice completely calm, clear, and completely devoid of any fear. The question hung in the air, shocking the entire table into absolute stunned silence. My father's jaw dropped open, his eyes wide with complete disbelief at my total lack of submission. Because if you are finished, I said slowly, standing up from my chair and smoothing the front of my crimson silk dress, I have a few very important corrections to make to your dramatic little story. And unlike you, I actually brought the receipts. Before I could even reach into my designer handbag to pull out the heavily documented proof of my brother's extreme corporate incompetence, Chloe suddenly let out a loud theatrical sob. The sound echoed sharply across the quiet dining room. She stood up, pushing her heavy mahogany chair back so forcefully it scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She buried her face in her manicured hands and began to cry. It was not a quiet or dignified cry. It was a loud, gasping performance designed entirely to suck all the oxygen out of the room and completely derail my momentum. "Oh, Maya, how can you stand there and be so incredibly cruel?" Chloe wailed, dropping her hands to reveal a face contorted in absolute fake agony. "You talk about bringing receipts like this as some kind of petty high school drama. This is our lives you are playing with. You are destroying our actual lives out of pure jealousy." She walked around the large dining table, her designer heels clicking softly until she reached Jamal. She threw her arms around his shoulders, pulling his head against her chest. Jamal leaned into her embrace, playing the part of the beaten down and exhausted husband perfectly. Chloe looked up at the extended family, her eyes wide and pleading desperately for their absolute sympathy. I stood there looking over my shoulder at her theatrical display, observing the distinct lack of actual tears on her perfectly powdered cheeks. "Do you all want to know what Maya really did to us?" Chloe cried out, her voice shaking with heavy artificial grief. "Because of her petty vindictive sabotage, we are completely broke. We had to put my beautiful luxury car up for sale yesterday morning just to afford the massive legal fees to fight the corporate lawsuits she intentionally caused." A collective gasp of horror rose from the aunts and uncles sitting around the table. Chloe pressed her advantage, squeezing her eyes shut tightly as if the pain was simply too much to bear. "But that is not even the worst part," Chloe continued, sniffing loudly and wiping at a completely dry eye. "I had to go to a pawn shop downtown yesterday afternoon. I had to pawn the vintage diamond necklace my late grandmother gave me on my wedding day. I had to stand there in that terrible dirty store and trade my most precious family heirlooms just so Jamal and I could keep the lights on in our house. And she stands there wearing a $1,000 silk dress, looking down at us like we are completely worthless." It was a masterful performance of pure, absolute fiction. Chloe did not own a vintage diamond necklace from her grandmother. The diamond necklace she was currently lying about was purchased 3 years ago using the Aura Glow corporate credit card during one of Jamal's unauthorized spending sprees. And as for her luxury car, it was a leased vehicle that the dealership had already threatened to repossess because they were 3 months behind on the payments. But the family did not know any of that. They only saw a weeping woman holding on to her husband, claiming that I had driven them into absolute poverty. Aunt Beatrice was the first one to break the silence. She pushed her plate of peach cobbler away and rushed over to wrap her arms around Chloe. "Oh, you poor sweet girl," Aunt Beatrice murmured loudly, casting a look of pure absolute hatred in my direction. "We are so incredibly sorry you have to go through this. You did not deserve this kind of betrayal." The rest of the family quickly followed suit. A loud murmur of agreement and deep condemnation swept through the dining room. Uncle George shook his head in disgust, staring at me as if I were a complete monster. Cousin Tanya whispered loudly to her husband about how absolutely heartless I had become since I started making money. The entire room turned into a hostile mob, united in their absolute hatred for the successful black woman who refused to stay in her designated place. My father, Reginald, stood at the head of the table, nodding approvingly at his daughter-in-law. He looked incredibly proud of Chloe for putting me in my place and cementing the narrative he had carefully constructed. Chloe pulled away from Aunt Beatrice and looked directly at me, her eyes narrowing with genuine malice beneath her fake sorrow. "I just wanted to be a good sister-in-law to you, Maya," she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I came into the company wanting to help you. I brought fresh marketing ideas. I wanted to build a lasting legacy for the children Jamal and I are planning to have. But you were just so incredibly jealous of Jamal's natural leadership and my creative vision. You could not stand the thought of us succeeding without your permission. I was up until 3 in the morning crying last night because you literally snatched the food right out of our future babies' mouths." The mention of imaginary unborn children was the absolute breaking point for the family. Several of my older aunts actually started crying out of pure sympathy for Chloe. The air in the room grew so incredibly toxic that it felt like breathing thick smoke. They were ready to physically throw me out of the mansion. They were completely entirely sold on the tragic story of Jamal and Chloe, the innocent, hardworking couple destroyed by the greedy, bitter sister. I did not interrupt her. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against the massive mountain of lies she was effortlessly building. I simply stood there radiating absolute perfect calm. In the high-stakes world of corporate negotiations, there is a golden rule that I always followed strictly. Never interrupt your opponent when they are in the middle of making a massive fatal mistake. I wanted Chloe to lie. I wanted her to build the tallest, most dramatic house of cards possible. I wanted the entire extended family to buy every single word of her tragic victim narrative. because the higher she climbed on her pedestal of lies, the more devastating the fall was going to be when I finally kicked the pillar out from underneath her. I looked around the grand dining room, taking a mental snapshot of every single relative who was currently glaring at me with absolute contempt. I memorized the disgusted look on Aunt Beatrice's face. I noted the arrogant, triumphant smirk Jamal was trying desperately to hide behind his wife's embrace. I watched my father stand tall and proud, completely convinced that he had successfully orchestrated my total public destruction. I let the heavy silence stretch for a few more seconds, allowing the weight of Chloe's fake tears to fully settle over the room. I reached down and picked up my designer handbag from the floor. The soft sound of the metal clasp snapping open was the only noise that cut through the quiet sniffling of my aunts. I reached my hand inside the bag, my fingers wrapping around the thick manila folder I had prepared specifically for this exact moment. Chloe had just delivered the performance of a lifetime, but unfortunately for her, I was the one holding the script for the final act. My hand emerged from the designer handbag, not with a stack of printed papers, but with my sleek smartphone. I kept my movements incredibly slow and deliberate. I did not look at Chloe, who was still standing next to Jamal, pretending to weep into his shoulder. I did not look at my father, who was standing at the head of the table waiting for me to leave his house, in absolute disgrace. Instead, I walked calmly away from my chair and moved toward the massive antique credenza positioned against the far wall of the formal dining room. Sitting perfectly centered on the polished wood was my father's expensive custom integrated wireless speaker system, which was currently playing soft classical holiday music in the background. The entire family watched me in complete silence. They were highly confused by my lack of an emotional reaction. They expected me to run out of the front door crying, or to start screaming wild apologies. They certainly did not expect me to hijack the audio system of the house. I tapped a few buttons on my phone screen easily, bypassing the familiar security code of my father's home network. A soft chime echoed from the ceiling speakers indicating that my device was successfully paired. The classical music abruptly stopped, leaving the dining room in a thick, uncomfortable silence. I turned around and leaned casually against the credenza. I looked directly at Jamal. His face was a mask of pure terror. He knew exactly what kind of corporate access I still possessed, and he knew that I did not make empty threats. I tapped the screen of my phone one final time, selecting a voicemail that had been left on my secure corporate line just 3 hours before I arrived at this dinner. I cranked the volume on my phone to the absolute maximum. A crisp, highly professional, and completely unforgiving voice echoed loudly through the entire dining room, filling every single corner of the massive space. Good afternoon, this is Richard Sterling, the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending at First Atlantic Corporate Bank. This message is for Reginald and Jamal as the listed guarantors of Oraglow Tech. This is a formal and final notification regarding the immediate freezing of all corporate accounts associated with your limited liability company. At 9 o'clock this morning, our automated fraud prevention system flagged an unauthorized and highly suspicious transaction in the amount of $215,000 at a luxury automotive dealership. A collective gasp swept through the dining room. Aunt Beatrice dropped her crystal wine glass onto the table, splashing dark red liquid across the pristine white linen tablecloth. My father flinched, as if he had been physically struck, taking a sudden step back and grabbing the back of his chair for support. Jamal closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands, knowing that his absolute destruction was now a public spectacle. But the voicemail was far from over. Upon manual review of the corporate accounts, the banker's voice continued, echoing mercilessly from the ceiling. We discovered a catastrophic loss of guaranteed revenue due to the immediate termination of your 3 primary logistics vendor contracts. Because the company cash flow is now officially in the negative, we have initiated a full corporate audit. Furthermore, it has come to our attention that the intellectual property operating on your servers does not legally belong to your company, putting you in severe violation of our commercial lending terms. Chloe stopped her fake crying instantly. She dropped her hands from her face and stared at the ceiling speakers with wide, terrified eyes. The illusion she had carefully crafted just moments ago was rapidly burning to ashes all around her. As a direct result of these massive financial breaches, Richard Sterling's voice announced, carrying the absolute weight of a judge delivering a guilty verdict. We are officially declaring your commercial office lease in a state of critical default. Because you, Reginald, used your primary residential property as collateral to secure the recent expansion loan, this is your official notice of impending asset seizure. If the outstanding balance of $2.4 million is not completely cleared within 7 business days, the bank will begin formal foreclosure proceedings on your Buckhead estate. Please contact our legal department immediately. The voicemail ended with a sharp electronic beep. The silence that followed was the most absolute and terrifying silence I had ever experienced in my entire life. It was a heavy, suffocating vacuum that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the massive dining room. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The extended family members who had just condemned me as a jealous and bitter monster were now sitting completely paralyzed, staring at Jamal and my father with expressions of pure, unfiltered horror. I reached down and disconnected my phone from the Bluetooth speaker. The soft click of my phone screen locking sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. I walked slowly back to my place at the table and picked up the thick manila folder I had originally intended to show them. I tossed it effortlessly onto the center of the mahogany table right next to the massive roasted turkey. Inside that folder are the printed bank statements, the intellectual property registrations, and the massive vendor termination notices. I said, my voice completely calm and echoing clearly in the silent room. Feel free to pass them around during dessert. I turned my attention to Chloe, who looked like she was about to vomit. You pawned a vintage diamond necklace, Chloe, I asked, tilting my head slightly and offering her a cold, razor-sharp smile. That is incredibly fascinating, considering the only diamond necklace you own was purchased 3 years ago using my corporate credit card while Jamal was supposed to be paying for server maintenance. And as for your luxury car, nobody forced you to sell it. The dealership repossessed it yesterday because Jamal stopped making the lease payments to fund his ridiculous corner office renovations. You are not a victim, Chloe. You are just a very bad liar who married an incredibly incompetent man. I looked past her and locked eyes with Jamal. He was physically shaking. The golden child was completely broken, exposed in front of the entire family as a massive fraud. You wanted the throne, Jamal? I said, my voice dropping to a chilling register. You sat in my boardroom and told me you were the visionary. You told me I was too emotional to handle the big leagues. Well, the big leagues just called. You managed to destroy a $10 million company, lose all of our clients, and lose our father's massive estate in exactly 21 days. That is not just failure, Jamal. That is absolute historical incompetence. Aunt Beatrice slowly turned her head and looked at Jamal. Her face was twisted in deep disgust. You bought a luxury sports car while the company was collapsing, she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute shock. You lied to all of us. You blamed Maya while you were actively bankrupting your own father. Uncle George stood up from the table, throwing his linen napkin down in pure disgust. This is an absolute disgrace, he muttered, shaking his head at my father. You raised a fool, Reginald, and you let him convince you to destroy the only child you have who actually knows how to work. I finally turned to look at my father. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had publicly disowned me just 5 minutes ago was completely gone. Reginald looked like a hollow, fragile old man. His face was a sickly shade of gray, and his hands were trembling violently as he gripped the edge of the dining table. He looked around his beautiful, extravagant dining room, at the crystal chandeliers, at the expensive artwork, and at the faces of his extended family who were now looking at him with deep pity and severe judgment. He realized in that exact moment that everything he valued in his life was completely gone. He had bet his entire legacy on a son who was entirely worthless, and he had alienated the only daughter who could have saved him. Maya. My father whispered, his voice cracking pitifully. The anger was completely gone, replaced by raw, desperate terror. Maya, please, you have to help us. You know the executives at the bank. You know the logistics partners. You can fix this. You cannot let them take the house. Where are your mother and I supposed to live? I looked at the man who had demanded my absolute loyalty for my entire life, but refused to offer me a single ounce of respect in return. I looked at the man who had just stood in front of 20 people and told me I was no longer his daughter. "I am incredibly sorry, Reginald," I replied, using his first name to finalize the absolute severing of our relationship. "But as you so loudly announced to the entire family just a few minutes ago, I am completely cut out of your will. I have been entirely disowned. I am no longer a part of this family, which means your massive financial catastrophe is no longer my problem. I highly suggest you and your brilliant chief executive officer start packing your boxes tonight. I hear the foreclosure process in Atlanta is incredibly fast." I reached down and picked up my designer handbag. I smoothed the front of my crimson silk dress, ensuring I looked absolutely perfect. I did not wait for his desperate apologies. I did not wait for Jamal to start crying. I turned my back on the massive dining table and walked toward the grand foyer. The loud, sharp clicking of my heels echoed perfectly against the marble floor, serving as the final punctuation mark to my absolute victory. "Happy Thanksgiving, everyone!" I called out over my shoulder without looking back. I walked out of the heavy front doors and stepped into the cool, crisp November night air. I climbed into the driver's seat of my car, started the engine, and drove away from the massive estate for the very last time. I left them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own devastating ruin, entirely trapped in the nightmare they had built with their own greedy hands. 6 months passed since that explosive Thanksgiving dinner. Winter melted away into a humid Atlanta spring, but for my father and Jamal, the season had brought absolutely nothing but cold, harsh reality. The devastating consequences of their monumental arrogance had entirely caught up to them. My new software firm, Nexus Logistics, had successfully launched within 90 days of my departure. Thanks to the absolute loyalty of my former team and my ironclad industry reputation, we secured 8 major enterprise contracts in our very first quarter. We were thriving. Oraglow Tech, however, was a completely different story. The company I had built with 10 years of blood and sweat was currently lying on its deathbed. Without the massive volume from the 3 primary logistics partners, Jamal had frantically tried to secure smaller, high-risk contracts just to generate some immediate cash flow. But without Marcus and the senior engineering team to properly manage the complex server load, the software architecture had suffered several catastrophic outages. Clients fled in massive droves, demanding huge financial refunds for the severe disruptions to their supply chains. The pastel pink walls and expensive espresso machines Chloe had so proudly installed could not hide the fact that the company was bleeding money at a completely unsustainable rate. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I finally received the phone call I had been expecting for half a year. It was not my father or Jamal calling this time. It was Arthur Vance, the senior partner at the highly prestigious law firm that handled my father's corporate affairs. Arthur sounded incredibly tired, his usually booming voice reduced to a quiet professional murmur. He formally requested my presence at his office to discuss the urgent corporate restructuring of Oraglow Tech. I arrived exactly on time, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray tailored suit that projected absolute authority. The environment inside the downtown law firm was suffocatingly formal. The heavy oak paneling and the cold fluorescent lighting created an atmosphere that felt more like an interrogation room than a place of business. I was escorted by a silent paralegal into a massive conference room at the end of a long hallway. When the heavy wooden door opened, the sight before me was almost shocking. Sitting across the wide, polished conference table were my father and my brother. If they had looked stressed at Thanksgiving, they looked completely destroyed now. Jamal sat hunched over his expensive tailored suit, hanging loosely on his suddenly thin frame. He was staring blankly down at his hands, completely unable to make eye contact with me. My father, Reginald, looked like he had aged a decade in just 6 short months. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had publicly disowned me was gone. He looked incredibly fragile, his skin pale and his hands resting weakly on top of a thin leather folder. "Have a seat, Maya," Arthur Vance said gently. gesturing to the empty leather chair positioned directly across from my father. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting on such short notice." I took my seat smoothly, placing my slim briefcase on the table. I did not offer any warm greetings. I simply looked at my father and waited for the inevitable surrender. Arthur cleared his throat, opening a thick file in front of him. "Let us bypass the usual pleasantries." Arthur began, his tone strictly professional, but tinged with genuine pity. "The financial situation at Oraglow Tech has reached a critical and irreversible state. Over the past 6 months, the company has accumulated roughly $2 million in unmanageable commercial debt. The bank has officially rejected their petition for a debt restructuring program. The commercial lease on the Midtown office space is in deep default, and the landlord has filed formal eviction papers." I kept my face completely impassive, absorbing the massive numbers. $2 million in debt. Jamal had essentially taken a highly profitable $10 million enterprise and driven it straight off a financial cliff at top speed. Furthermore, Arthur continued adjusting his glasses. As the primary guarantor of the corporate expansion loans, Reginald's personal assets have been severely compromised. The bank has initiated the formal foreclosure process on the Buckhead residential estate. The situation is dire. Bankruptcy is no longer a strategic option. It is an impending certainty. My father finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. The deep resentment and anger were completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate kind of pleading that made me feel slightly sick to my stomach. "Maya," my father whispered, his voice cracking with dry, exhausted emotion. "We are entirely out of options. Jamal tried to fix it. We hired expensive consultants. We tried to pivot the business model, but the market simply will not respond. The bank will not return our phone calls anymore. They are taking the house in 2 weeks. They are taking absolutely everything I have worked for my entire life." I did not say a word. I just let him sit in the incredibly uncomfortable silence of his own making. Jamal kept his head bowed, completely silent, a broken man who finally realized his ego had a massive, devastating price tag. Arthur reached into the thin leather folder in front of my father and pulled out a single piece of paper. He slid it across the polished table until it rested right in front of me. I looked down at the document. It was a formal corporate transfer agreement, almost identical to the one they had aggressively forced me to sign all those months ago. "We are not asking for a bailout," Maya Arthur explained carefully, tapping the paper with his expensive pen. "Reginald and Jamal are prepared to formally surrender all executive control and 100% of the corporate equity back to you. They are offering to sell Oraglow Tech back to you for the nominal sum of exactly $1. A single dollar." The incredible irony of the situation was almost poetic. They had stolen my empire, completely destroyed its value, and were now begging me to take the burning wreckage back for less than the cost of a cup of coffee. "If you step back in as chief executive officer," Arthur continued, leaning forward slightly, "your reputation in the logistics industry is strong enough that we believe the commercial lenders might halt the foreclosure proceedings. The major partners might return if they know you are back at the helm. You can save the company, Maya. You can save your family's home." My father reached a trembling hand across the table, his fingers desperately reaching toward mine. "Please, Maya," he begged, tears finally welling up in his tired eyes. "I know I was wrong. I was so incredibly blind. I let my pride ruin everything. Please, just sign the paper. Come back and save us. I will never question your leadership again." I looked at the piece of paper offering me my company back for $1. I looked at the broken brother who had once told me I was too emotional to lead. And I looked at the father who had publicly disowned me to protect a massive lie. They thought this was the grand climax of the story. They thought my sense of family loyalty would finally override my logic, that I would sign the paper and spend the next 5 years of my life cleaning up their $2 million disaster just to earn their toxic love. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a sleek silver pen. Jamal finally looked up, a tiny spark of desperate hope flashing in his bloodshot eyes. My father let out a long, shaky breath, clearly believing that he had finally won. I held the pen above the signature line for a long moment, letting them savor the brief illusion of their salvation. And then I smiled. I did not press the tip of the silver pen to the paper. Instead, I let it drop from my fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a sharp metallic clatter that sounded like a final heavy judgment in the quiet conference room. I pushed the corporate transfer agreement back across the table toward my father. I do not want it, I said, my voice perfectly calm and echoing clearly in the massive room. I do not want to buy Aura Glow Tech for a single dollar because it is not even worth a single penny. My father looked completely stunned. His trembling hand hovered over the rejected contract. Maya, please, he whispered, his voice laced with absolute panic. You are not thinking clearly. This is a $10 million company. I am giving it to you for practically nothing. You know all the clients. You can easily rebuild it. You are the only one who can save the family now. It was a $10 million company 6 months ago, I corrected him, leaning back comfortably in my expensive leather chair. Today, it is a $2 million massive liability wrapped in a catastrophic commercial lease default. You are not offering me a gift, Dad. You are offering me a burning building and asking me to pay for the incredible privilege of putting out your massive fire. I already have a highly successful software firm of my own. Why on earth would I want to adopt your spectacular financial failure? Arthur Vance, the senior partner, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He adjusted his glasses and looked at me with a mixture of professional respect and deep, underlying concern. Miss Maya, Arthur said carefully, if you do not assume executive control and actively restructure this massive debt, the commercial bank will proceed with the immediate foreclosure of your father's residential estate. They will aggressively liquidate every single asset tied to the Aura Glow Holding Company. Your family will be completely ruined financially. I am fully aware of the aggressive commercial lending process, Arthur. I replied smoothly, crossing my legs and resting my hands in my lap. But you see, there is a very massive piece of the puzzle that my father and my brother conveniently failed to mention when they retained your highly expensive legal services to facilitate this little surrender. I reached into my slim leather briefcase and pulled out a thick black folder. I did not slide it across the table for them to touch. I simply opened it and pulled out a single sheet of premium legal paper heavily stamped with official federal copyright seals. I held it up so Arthur could clearly read the bold text printed at the very top of the page. 4 years ago, I explained, my voice taking on a sharp and clinical edge, when Aura Glow first began expanding its domestic logistics network. I realized that my father's holding company was a massive vulnerability. I knew that the limited liability company he forced me to put under his name was a ticking time bomb of unearned entitlement. So I hired an independent intellectual property attorney. I legally registered the core algorithmic architecture, the proprietary supply chain routing software, and the entire digital infrastructure of the platform under a completely separate private holding firm. A firm where I am the absolute sole proprietor and the only legally recognized shareholder. Jamal's head snapped up from his chest. His bloodshot eyes widened in pure absolute terror as my words slowly penetrated his thick, arrogant skull. My father looked back and forth between me and Arthur Vance, completely confused by the complex corporate legal terminology I was using. Arthur leaned forward, his professional composure completely shattering in an instant. He squinted at the federal document in my hand and then looked at Jamal with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Are you telling me? Arthur asked, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming confidence, that Reginald's corporate entity does not actually own the Aura Glow logistics software. They own the brand name, I confirmed, offering the senior lawyer a cold, victorious smile. They own the pastel pink office walls that Chloe so proudly painted. They own the imported Italian leather couches and the ridiculously fancy espresso machines in the break room. But the actual product, the highly advanced logistics algorithm that processes millions of data points every single second, has been my exclusive personal property for the last 4 years. Aura Glow Tech was never a software company, Arthur. It was merely a licensed vendor operating my proprietary technology. And when Jamal and my father forced me to resign 6 months ago, they also conveniently terminated the primary corporate licensing agreement that gave them the legal right to use my intellectual property in the first place. The silence in the room was absolutely deafening. It was the kind of heavy quiet that only happens right before a massive, devastating explosion. The camera of my memory slowly zoomed in on Jamal's face as the devastating reality finally crushed the last remaining breath right out of his lungs. He was not just a failed chief executive officer who made bad financial investments. He was a massive corporate liability. For the past 6 months, I continued my voice slicing through the heavy air like a razor blade. Jamal has been actively operating a highly complex logistics platform without a valid software license. Every single client transaction, every single data routing protocol, and every single server login was a direct and flagrant violation of my federal copyright. You did not just run my beautiful company into the ground, Jamal. You committed massive, unprecedented corporate infringement on a daily basis for half a year. I reached back into the black folder and pulled out a freshly printed corporate invoice. It was heavily detailed, itemizing every single unauthorized use of my software over the past 6 months of his fraudulent leadership. I slid the crisp invoice across the polished mahogany table. It came to a complete stop right in front of Jamal's trembling hands. "That is the retroactive licensing fee," I announced, my tone completely devoid of any mercy or familial warmth. "It includes the standard operational rates, massive punitive damages for unauthorized commercial use, and the maximum federal penalties for intellectual property theft. The total balance due is exactly $3.5 million. And unlike your generous commercial bank, I do not offer any flexible debt restructuring programs." Jamal stared down at the invoice like it was a venomous snake preparing to strike him. The bold, black numbers seemed to physically knock the wind out of him. $3.5 million. He was already drowning in $2 million of commercial bank debt, and now he owed his estranged sister millions more. The golden child, the arrogant visionary who bought $250,000 sports car with stolen funds, was completely and utterly broken beyond any hope of repair. He let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. It was the most pathetic noise I had ever heard a grown man make. Jamal slumped forward in his expensive leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands as a violent wave of absolute despair washed over him. He began to weep loudly right in the middle of the prestigious law firm. He cried for his lost ego, his shattered reputation, and the terrifying reality of his massive impending bankruptcy. My father sat completely paralyzed next to him. He stared at the invoice with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth hanging open in silent, absolute shock. He had sacrificed his entire relationship with his daughter to elevate a son who had just single-handedly destroyed the family legacy and plunged them into a bottomless pit of insurmountable debt. My father slowly reached a shaking hand up to his chest, gripping his expensive dress shirt as if his heart were physically breaking in half right inside his ribcage. Arthur Vance slowly closed his legal file, pushing it away from him across the table. He looked at my father and Jamal with a mixture of professional disgust and deep, profound pity. "As your legal counsel," Arthur said quietly, "I highly advise you to accept the absolute reality of this situation. There is absolutely no legal defense against a federal intellectual property violation of this massive magnitude. You are completely exposed and you have absolutely zero leverage." I picked up my silver pen and slipped it elegantly back into my blazer pocket. I closed my slim briefcase and stood up from the massive conference table, looking down at the two men who had tried to erase my existence from my own creation. They wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate monopoly, but they never even bothered to read the rules of the board. "You can keep your empty shell of a company, Dad," I said, my voice soft but incredibly sharp. "I do not need it anymore. but I strongly suggest you liquidate whatever assets you have left immediately, because my legal team expects that $3.5 million invoice to be paid in full by the very end of the month. Have a wonderful afternoon, gentlemen. I turned toward the heavy wooden door of the conference room, preparing to leave them to their misery. But before my hand could even touch the brass handle, the door swung violently inward. Chloe stood in the hallway, looking completely frantic. She had clearly been pacing in the lobby, unable to handle the agonizing suspense of waiting for her financial salvation. She gripped her expensive handbag so tightly, her knuckles were completely white. "Did she sign it?" Chloe demanded, her voice shrill and desperate as she looked past me toward the conference table. "Jamal, tell me she signed the transfer paper. The leasing office called me twice this morning, threatening to repossess my new car. We need the corporate bank accounts unfrozen right now." Jamal could not even lift his head to look at his wife. He remained slumped over in the expensive leather chair, weeping silently into his hands. My father was staring blankly at the mahogany table. His hands were trembling so violently that they rattled the legal folders sitting in front of him. His absolute panic was completely palpable. I looked at Chloe and let out a soft, pitying sigh. "I did not sign the paper, Chloe," I said, my tone perfectly smooth and completely unbothered. "But since you decided to crash this private legal meeting, there is one final piece of administrative business we really need to discuss regarding your immediate living situation." I turned back to face my father and Arthur Vance. "You mentioned earlier that the bank was preparing to foreclose on the Buckhead mansion, Dad," I said, carrying a deceptive and chilling warmth in my voice. "When I heard the news, I actually reached out directly to the commercial lending board at First Atlantic Corporate Bank. They were incredibly motivated to completely offload a highly toxic asset tied to a failing logistics company." Arthur Vance looked up sharply, his jaw dropping slightly as his brilliant legal mind raced to catch up with my ultimate strategy. "I instructed the wealth management division of my new investment firm to purchase your defaulted commercial loan," I announced, dropping the final fatal blow onto the silent room. "I bought the massive debt for absolute pennies on the dollar. The corporate bank no longer owns the mortgage to your precious estate. I do. I am officially your primary secured creditor." My father's trembling hands suddenly froze. His face twisted in a look of absolute pure horror as he realized that the daughter he had publicly disowned was now his absolute landlord. "And unlike a traditional commercial bank," I continued, my voice dropping to a terrifying and absolute whisper, "I do not grant any 30-day grace periods. You have exactly 7 days to completely vacate my property. I want you, Jamal and Chloe, entirely moved out of the Buckhead estate by next Tuesday morning. If you are not completely gone, I will have the county sheriff physically throw your belongings onto the front lawn." Chloe's face twisted in absolute, unfiltered panic. The manufactured victim routine she had played at Thanksgiving was completely gone, replaced by the raw, primal terror of a woman who was about to become entirely homeless. She looked at Jamal, the man who had promised her a massive tech empire. The man who had just single-handedly destroyed her entire luxurious life in less than 6 months. "You absolute complete idiot!" Chloe screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, undiluted venom. She did not rush over to comfort him. She did not play the role of the loyal, supportive wife. She reached down to her left hand and aggressively pulled her heavy diamond wedding ring off her finger. She threw the ring directly at Jamal with maximum force. The expensive diamond struck his chest and clattered loudly against the polished hardwood floor. "I am filing for divorce this afternoon," she yelled. "Do not you ever try to contact me again." Chloe turned on her designer heels and sprinted out of the conference room, leaving Jamal sobbing uncontrollably and my father staring into the absolute void of his ruined legacy. I stepped right over the discarded diamond ring, walked confidently out of the prestigious law firm, and stepped forward into the bright, warm sunlight of my beautiful new life. The bright, warm sunlight of that Tuesday afternoon seamlessly transitioned into the brilliant overhead lighting of a massive glass-walled boardroom high above the Manhattan skyline. It was exactly 3 months after that final devastating meeting at the law office, and my entire life had completely transformed. I stood at the head of a sleek modern conference table, wearing a pristine white tailored suit, projecting absolute confidence and undeniable power. I was mid-pitch, presenting the massive global scalability of my newly rebranded software platform to a room full of the most ruthless and wealthy venture capitalists in the country. While I was busy securing my financial future, my father and my brother were painfully adjusting to their brutal new reality. They did not meet my strict 7-day deadline to vacate the Buckhead estate, so I made good on my exact promise. The county sheriff arrived on a bright Tuesday morning and physically escorted them off the luxury property. Without the massive corporate income and completely drowning in over $5 million of combined commercial and personal debt, they were forced to move into a cramped and run-down 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta. Chloe finalized her bitter divorce and took whatever small personal assets Jamal had left, leaving him completely broke and entirely unemployable in the tech sector. My father lost his massive house, his exclusive country club memberships, and his precious pristine reputation in the community. I, on the other hand, took the proprietary logistics algorithm I had fought so fiercely to protect and fully integrated it into the Nexus Logistics ecosystem. The investors in that Manhattan boardroom saw the undeniable value of my brilliant intellectual property and my proven track record. By the end of that single afternoon, I successfully closed a massive $30 million Series A funding round. I walked out of that building as the undisputed sole owner of a rapidly expanding tech empire. I completely changed my personal phone number and my private email address. I instructed my corporate security team to permanently block my father and my brother from ever entering any building I owned. I severed the toxic bloodline with a clean, absolute cut, leaving their suffocating expectations completely behind me. I sit comfortably on the plush white velvet sofa in the private penthouse lounge of my new corporate headquarters. The massive city skyline stretches out brilliantly behind me through the floor-to-ceiling glass, but my absolute focus is entirely on you. I look directly into the camera lens, leaning forward just a fraction to speak directly to anyone who has ever felt suffocated by the heavy chains of family obligation. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that family loyalty is an absolute requirement, even when that exact loyalty is rapidly destroying our mental health and draining our bank accounts. For years, I paid the black tax in full. I sacrificed my own peace, my own financial security, and my own youth to carry the massive weight of a family that only valued me for what I could provide. They mistook my silent financial support for weakness. They completely believed that my deep desire for a father's love would blind me to their ultimate greed. But here is the absolute truth that nobody tells you. You cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that is actively making you sick. True independence requires radical action. You have to be completely willing to draw an absolute line in the sand and back it up with undeniable legal boundaries. Contracts, patents, and intellectual property registrations are not just boring corporate paperwork. They are the absolute armor you must wear when you enter the battlefield of business, even when the people sitting across the boardroom table share your exact last name. I used the law to completely shield myself from their entitlement, and it saved my entire life. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to use the law to fight back against your own flesh and blood? Have you ever had to draw a massive boundary to stop a toxic family member from stealing your peace or your success? Let me know your story down in the comments below. Do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about taking back your absolute power. Remember, you are the only author of your own legacy. Do not ever let anyone else hold the pen.